close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. You are safe here. Tonight we travel back more than 3,000 years to a land of sand and stone and secrets, to a civilization that built monuments so enormous they still stand today, defying time itself, to ancient Egypt, a place of pharaohs and priests, of gods with animal heads and rituals we are only beginning to understand. This is not the Egypt of adventure movies or treasure hunts. This is the Egypt of shadows. The Egypt of shadows. The Egypt of secrets kept in darkness for millennia. The Egypt of things that were hidden deliberately, carefully, because some knowledge was considered too dangerous, too sacred, too terrible to share. We will walk through temple corridors at midnight when the priests performed rituals the common people never saw. We will descend into tombs sealed for thousands of years. We will stand in the desert at dawn and watch the sun rise over monuments built by methods we still cannot fully explain. And we will uncover secrets, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, carefully, with the patience that 3,000 years of history deserves. Find a comfortable position. Let the pillow support your head. Let your muscles relax, one by one, from your shoulders down through your arms, through your chest, your legs, all the way to your feet. You have nowhere to be but here. Nothing to do but listen and sleep whenever sleep comes for you. The secrets of ancient Egypt will still be here when you wake. Let us begin. In the desert hills west of ancient Thebes, far from the fertile Nile Valley, there was a village. It had no name that ordinary Egyptians knew. On maps, if maps had existed as we know them, it would have been unmarked. The valley where it sat was remote, harsh, nearly waterless, not the kind of place anyone would choose to live unless they had no choice. The village was called Deir el-Medina, and the people who lived there were workers, but not ordinary workers. These were the men who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the artisans who carved the chambers deep into the mountain rock, the artists who painted the walls with scenes from the Book of the Dead, the sculptors who created the sarcophagi that would hold the mummified bodies of pharaohs. They knew secrets that could not be allowed to spread. They knew where the tombs were hidden. They knew what treasures were buried inside. They knew the layouts, the false passages designed to fool tomb robbers, the hidden chambers where the most valuable items were stored. This knowledge made them invaluable. It also made them dangerous. So they were kept apart from the rest of Egyptian society, isolated in their desert village, living under constant supervision, their movements controlled, their contact with the outside world carefully limited. They were prisoners of their own expertise. Let us walk through their village now, in the cool hours before dawn, when the desert is still dark and the workers are sleeping in their small mud brick houses. Deir el-Medina sits in a narrow valley between steep desert cliffs. There is no natural water source here. Every drop had to be carried in from the Nile several miles away. This was not an accident. The lack of water was part of the control system. A population that depends entirely on others for water cannot easily rebel or escape. The houses are small but well built. Mud brick walls, wooden roof beams, rooms arranged in a standard pattern, a front room for receiving guests, a second room for daily living, a kitchen area in back, and stairs leading to the roof where people sleep in hot weather. These are not the homes of slaves. The workers of Deir el-Medina were skilled craftsmen, well paid by the standards of their time. They received wages in grain and beer, oil and fish, cloth and firewood. The community had its own administrators, its own legal system for resolving disputes, its own small temples where they could worship their gods. But they could not leave, not permanently, not without permission. The village was surrounded by a wall, not a massive fortification, but enough to mark the boundary. Guards were posted at the entrance. Workers who wanted to visit Thebes needed authorization. Their families lived with them in the village, hostages to ensure compliance. This was the bargain, exceptional pay and living conditions in exchange for complete isolation and absolute secrecy. The workers accepted it because they had no choice, and because, perhaps, there was pride in the work. They were building eternity. The tombs they carved would last forever. The paintings they created would be seen by the gods themselves. Their work was sacred. even if it could never be acknowledged publicly. In the darkness before dawn, the village is quiet. Soon, the foreman's voice will call the workers to rise. They will eat a simple breakfast of bread and beer. They will gather their tools, copper chisels, wooden mallets, bronze saws, the specialized instruments of their trade, and they will walk up the narrow path between the cliffs, over the mountain ridge and down into the Valley of the Kings, where they will spend the day working in near total darkness, cutting deeper and deeper into the mountain, creating chambers for men who believed they would live forever. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings are not simple burial chambers. They are architectural marvels. Complex systems of corridors and rooms, some extending more than 100 meters into the mountain. The walls are covered in intricate carvings and paintings, thousands of square meters of detailed religious texts and imagery. All of this was created in near darkness. The workers could not use open flames extensively. The smoke would damage the paintings and make breathing impossible in the enclosed spaces. They worked by the light of oil lamps, small clay vessels that provided just enough illumination to see the immediate work area. Imagine carving precise hieroglyphs in flickering lamplight deep underground, where the air is hot and still, and the only sounds are the tap-tap-tap of chisels on stone and the breathing of the men around you. The workers divided into crews, left side and right side, named after the two sides of the tomb they were carving. Competition between the crews was encouraged. Who could cut more stone? Whose paintings were more beautiful? The foreman kept records, tracking productivity, noting which workers excelled and which fell behind. Some of the tombs took years to complete. The workers would spend their entire careers on one or two major projects, creating chambers they would never speak about publicly. For pharaohs they might see only from a distance during festivals. The secrecy was absolute. When a tomb was finished and the pharaoh was buried, the workers who built it were the greatest threat to its security. They knew exactly where it was. They knew how to navigate the false passages. They knew where the burial chamber was hidden and what treasures it contained. So after each burial, there was always the question, what to do with the workers? Sometimes they were simply warned. Terrible punishments were promised for anyone who revealed the tomb's location or helped robbers find it. The penalties were not just for the individual, but for their entire family. Sometimes the warnings were not enough. There are suggestions in the archaeological record, nothing definitive but hints, that after certain royal burials, workers disappeared. Not all of them, not obviously, but a few here and there, the ones who knew the most or talked the most or seemed least trustworthy. They simply stopped appearing in the village records. No explanation, no trial, just absence. This is one of the darker secrets of Deir el-Medina. The workers who built eternity for the pharaohs may have paid for that knowledge with their lives. We know about tomb robbery in ancient Egypt because the Egyptians themselves documented it. Several papyri survive from the 20th dynasty around 1100 BCE, recording the trials of tomb robbers. These are official court documents detailing the testimony of accused criminals, the evidence against them, and their punishments. The papyri are chilling to read. They describe organized gangs who broke into the tombs of pharaohs and nobles, stripped the mummies of their gold and jewels, and melted down priceless artifacts for the raw metal. The robbers knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to find it, because many of them had worked on the tombs. One papyrus describes the confession of a stonemason named Amenpanufa. He admits to being part of a gang that robbed the tomb of King Sobekemsaf II. The gang included several other workers from Deir el-Medina, men who had helped build and decorate tombs and now used that knowledge to plunder them. Amenpanufa's confession is detailed. He describes entering the tomb through a tunnel they dug from a nearby chamber. He describes finding the burial chamber and breaking open the sarcophagus. He describes unwrapping the mummy and stripping the gold from its body. "We set fire to their coverings," he says. "We stole their furniture and the gold and silver and bronze that was on them." The papyrus does not describe what happened to Amenpanufa after his confession, but based on other records, we can guess. The punishment for tomb robbery was death, not quick death. The standard punishment was impalement. The condemned person was placed on a sharpened stake and left to die slowly, displayed publicly as a warning to others. The workers of Deir el-Medina lived with this knowledge, that if they betrayed the secrets they knew, if they helped robbers or revealed locations or took even the smallest item from a tomb they were building, the punishment would be terrible beyond description. And yet, some did it anyway, because the treasures in the tombs were beyond imagining. Because a single gold amulet from a pharaoh's burial could feed a family for a year, because the temptation was too great and the opportunity was there, and human nature has not changed in 3,000 years. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramses III, around 1170 BCE, something unprecedented happened. The workers of Deir el-Medina went on strike. This may seem unremarkable to modern ears. Workers strike all the time in the modern world. But in ancient Egypt, this was revolutionary. The workers put down their tools and refused to work. They marched to the administrative offices and demanded to speak to officials. They sat down in front of the mortuary temple and would not move. Their complaint was simple. They had not been paid. For weeks, their rations had not arrived. No grain, no oil, no beer. Their families were hungry. The government had broken its side of the bargain, so the workers refused to fulfill theirs. We know about this strike because a scribe named Amenak recorded it. His account is straightforward, matter-of-fact, noting the dates and the workers' complaints and the officials' responses. The officials promised the rations would come. The workers went back to work. The rations did not come. The workers struck again. This pattern repeated several times over the following months. Each time, the officials made promises. Each time, the promises were not kept. Why had the payment stopped? Because Egypt was in crisis. The central government was weakening. The costs of maintaining the empire were overwhelming. Resources that should have gone to paying workers were being diverted to military campaigns or consumed by corruption. The workers of Deir el-Medina were caught in the collapse of the system they served. They had built tombs for pharaohs who claimed to be gods, but the gods could not protect them from hunger. The strike was a crack in the facade of Egyptian power, a moment when the ordinary people who built the monument said, "Enough. We are hungry and our children are hungry, and your promises of eternal glory mean nothing to us." The strike did not overthrow the system. Eventually, the rations resumed, at least partially. The workers went back to their tombs. The government limped forward, but something had changed. The workers had learned that they had power, that their knowledge and skills made them essential, that even pharaohs needed them more than they needed the pharaohs. This was dangerous knowledge, more dangerous perhaps than knowing where the tombs were hidden. Deir el-Medina was abandoned sometime around 1100 BCE as the New Kingdom collapsed and Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and foreign rule. The workers dispersed. Some probably moved to Thebes and tried to resume normal lives. Some may have used their knowledge of the tombs for less legitimate purposes. The village itself was left to the desert. For nearly 3,000 years, it sat empty. Sand filled the streets, the roofs collapsed, the walls slowly eroded. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries CE, archaeologists began excavating. What they found was extraordinary. Because the desert preserves what other climates destroy, the village of Deir el-Medina is one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian sites. Houses still stand. Tools remain where they were dropped. Pottery, furniture, clothing, the ordinary objects of daily life survived. So did the written records. Thousands of ostraka, fragments of pottery and limestone used as notepads, were found scattered through the village. The workers wrote on them constantly. Shopping lists, love letters, legal complaints, records of debts and marriages and divorces. From these fragments, archaeologists have reconstructed the lives of the workers in remarkable detail. We know their names. We know what they earned. We know who they married and who they fought with and what they bought and sold. We know them as individuals, not as anonymous builders of monuments. This is unusual in ancient history. Most of the time we know about kings and priests and nobles, the elite who left monumental records. The ordinary people are invisible. But the workers of Deir el-Medina were not ordinary. They were secret keepers, prisoners of their own knowledge, men who built eternity in darkness and were never allowed to speak about it. Their village in the desert was both workshop and prison. And now, 3,000 years later, their secrets are revealed not through betrayal or tomb robbery, but through archaeology, through patient excavation of their trash heaps and ruined houses, through reading the notes they scratched on broken pottery, through listening to voices that were silenced 3 millennia ago. They built tombs for pharaohs, but it is their village, not the tombs, that tells us the truth about ancient Egypt. That beneath the monuments and the gold and the claims of divine power, there were people, ordinary people with families and debts and complaints about their wages. People who knew too much, and who paid for that knowledge with their freedom. Let your breathing slow. The workers of Deir el-Medina are sleeping now, as you will sleep soon. Their secrets are safe in the darkness of the tombs they carved. We will visit those tombs shortly. But first, let us rest here in the desert night, under stars that have not changed in 3,000 years, and listen to the silence of stones. There was a pharaoh who tried to change everything. His name was Akhenaten, though that was not the name he was born with. He was born Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, heir to the most powerful empire in the ancient world. When he took the throne around 1353 BCE, Egypt was at the height of its power. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories. The temples were filled with gold. The priesthood of Amun-Ra controlled vast wealth and wielded enormous political influence. Everything was perfect. Amenhotep IV destroyed it all, not with war or conquest, but with an idea. He decided that all the gods of Egypt, Amun-Ra and Osiris, Isis and Horus, Thoth and Anubis, the hundreds of deities that Egyptians had worshipped for thousands of years, were false. There was only one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun. Everything else was a lie. This was not reform. This was revolution. And like most revolutions, it ended in blood and erasure and secrets buried so deeply that they were lost for more than 3,000 years. Let us travel now to the city Akhenaten built. A city in the desert, a city that was occupied for barely 20 years before being abandoned and deliberately forgotten. A city whose ruins still hold secrets about what happens when a pharaoh goes too far. In the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten did something no pharaoh had ever done. He abandoned Thebes. Thebes was the traditional capital, the city of the god Amun-Ra, home to the greatest temples in Egypt. Leaving Thebes was not just a political decision, it was a religious statement. Akhenaten traveled north along the Nile until he found a place that had never been dedicated to any god. A barren stretch of desert on the east bank of the river, surrounded by cliffs that formed a natural amphitheater. Here, he said, would be the new capital. He called it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. We call it Amarna. Construction began immediately. Thousands of workers were mobilized. In an extraordinary feat of organization and labor, a complete city was built in less than 5 years. Palaces for the pharaoh, houses for nobles and administrators, workshops for craftsmen, temples to the Aten. But these were not like the old temples, dark chambers filled with mystery and priestly secrets. These were open courtyards where the Aten's light could shine directly on the worshippers. No more hidden rituals, no more priestly intermediaries. Just the pharaoh, his family, and the sun. The city was beautiful by all accounts. The palace complex was enormous, decorated with colorful painted tiles and surrounded by gardens. The houses of the nobles were spacious and well appointed, with indoor bathrooms and servant quarters. But something was wrong. Archaeologists excavating Amarna have found evidence of malnutrition in the skeletal remains of ordinary workers. The water supply was inadequate. Disease was common. The mortality rate, especially among children, was shockingly high. The beautiful city, built to honor the one true God, was, for most of its inhabitants, a death trap. Why? Because it was built too quickly and in the wrong place. The site Akhenaten chose had no natural advantages. It was far from major trade routes. The agricultural land nearby was limited. The city had to be supplied entirely from elsewhere, and as Akhenaten's religious revolution alienated more and more of Egypt's traditional power structures, those supplies became increasingly unreliable. the people of Akhetaten were starving in the midst of plenty, cut off from the rest of Egypt by their pharaoh's obsession. If you have seen images of Akhenaten, you know something was different about him. The standard portrayal of Egyptian pharaohs was highly idealized. They were shown as young, strong, perfect physical specimens, regardless of their actual appearance. This was not vanity, it was theology. The pharaoh was a god in human form. Gods do not age or weaken or suffer physical imperfections. Akhenaten's portraits are nothing like this. He is shown with an elongated skull, a protruding belly, wide hips, thin arms. His face is gaunt with a long chin and full lips. The overall effect is unsettling, not grotesque exactly, but not normal either. His wife Nefertiti and their daughters are shown in the same style. Elongated heads, exaggerated features, bodies that seem almost alien. For more than a century, scholars have debated what this meant. Some believed Akhenaten suffered from a genetic disorder, Marfan syndrome perhaps, or some other condition that would explain the unusual proportions. Others argued that the art style was symbolic, not realistic, that Akhenaten was trying to show himself as beyond normal human categories, neither fully male nor fully female, embodying both creative principles. More recent analysis suggests a third possibility, that the art was propaganda. Akhenaten wanted to be seen as different from all previous pharaohs. He was not just another king in a long line. He was the chosen prophet of the one true God. His very body was a sign of his special status. So he commissioned art that made him look unique, strange, otherworldly. Whether this reflected his actual appearance or was purely symbolic, we may never know. His mummy has never been definitively identified. There are candidates, mummies found in other tombs that might be him, but DNA analysis has been inconclusive. Akhenaten remains, even in death, deliberately obscure. But the art survives, and it tells us that whatever else he was, Akhenaten understood the power of image. He used visual propaganda as effectively as any modern dictator, creating an iconography that was instantly recognizable and unlike anything that had come before. The priests of Amun-Ra in Thebes must have seen these images and known this was not just religious reform, this was war. Akhenaten did not simply promote the Aten, he actively suppressed worship of the other gods. This was unprecedented in Egyptian history. Egypt had always been religiously syncretic. New gods were added to the pantheon constantly. Foreign deities were incorporated as Egypt conquered new territories. Different regions had their own preferred gods, and this was not seen as contradictory. The gods were many and their relationships were complex, but there was room for all of them. Akhenaten ended this. In the later years of his reign, he ordered the names of the old gods chiseled out of monuments. Teams of workers went through temples and tombs, systematically erasing hieroglyphs. The name of Amun-Ra was a particular target. Everywhere it appeared, on temple walls, on statues, on obelisks, it was destroyed. This was not just vandalism. In Egyptian belief, the name was power. To erase the name was to erase the god's existence. Akhenaten was attempting theological genocide. The temples of the old gods were closed. Their priesthoods were disbanded. The vast wealth that had supported them was confiscated and redirected to the worship of the Aten. For the priests, this was catastrophic. The priesthood of Amun-Ra was one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt. The high priest controlled wealth comparable to the pharaoh's own. Thousands of people depended on the temples for employment. The festivals and rituals organized the calendar and gave structure to ordinary people's lives. All of this was swept away. We have no records of organized resistance, no accounts of priests leading rebellions or nobles plotting against the pharaoh. But the silence is suspicious. Egypt was a literate society. Events were recorded. The absence of records about opposition to Akhenaten suggests that those records were deliberately destroyed later. What we do have are hints. A few letters from the Amarna archive, the diplomatic correspondence found at the site, mention unrest in Egypt. Foreign rulers writing to Akhenaten express surprise that he has not responded to their previous messages. There are suggestions that the Egyptian administration was in chaos, unable to handle routine matters. Was this simple incompetence, or was Akhenaten's government under pressure from internal enemies, fighting a quiet war against the old priesthoods and the nobles who supported them? We do not know, but we know how the story ended. Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign, around 1336 BCE. The circumstances of his death are unknown. There is no announcement of illness, no period of mourning. His name simply disappears from the records. One year he is pharaoh, the next year he is not. This is strange. Pharaohs were gods. Their deaths were cosmic events, carefully documented and ritualized. Even pharaohs who died in battle or were assassinated received proper funerary treatment and were recorded in the king lists. Akhenaten was erased. After his death, there was a brief period of confusion. A mysterious figure named Smenkhare appears in the records for a few years, possibly ruling as co-regent or successor. Then Smenkhare also disappears. The throne passed to a child, a boy about 9 years old, married to one of Akhenaten's daughters. His name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. Within a few years, his name was changed. Tutankhamen, living image of Amen. The old gods were back. The boy pharaoh, probably under the guidance of powerful advisors like the General Horemheb and the Vizier I, issued a decree restoring the traditional religion. The temples were reopened, the priesthoods were re-established, the worship of Amun-Ra resumed as if it had never stopped. And Akhetaten, the beautiful city built to honor the Aten, was abandoned, not gradually, not over decades as population shifted. Immediately, within a few years of Akhenaten's death, the city was empty, the palaces stood vacant, the temples to the Aten were silent. The houses of nobles and workers alike were left to the desert. No one was allowed to remain. The city was forbidden. And then, systematically, Akhenaten's memory was attacked. The Romans had a practice called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. When someone was deemed an enemy of the state, their name was chiseled out of inscriptions. Their statues were destroyed. All evidence of their existence was systematically erased. The Egyptians did this to Akhenaten, but they went further. They did not just erase his name. They erased his entire reign. In the official king lists compiled in later dynasties, Akhenaten does not appear. The reign goes directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, skipping over Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamen, and I entirely. 18 years of Egyptian history were removed from the record. Monuments that Akhenaten had built were dismantled. The stones were reused as fill material in other construction projects. At the Temple of Karnak, archaeologists have found thousands of blocks from Akhenaten's buildings hidden inside the walls of later structures. The statues of Akhenaten were smashed. His reliefs were defaced. At Amarna itself, deliberate destruction is evident. The royal tomb where Akhenaten was buried was vandalized. His sarcophagus was smashed to pieces. If his mummy was there, it was destroyed or removed. This was not simple robbery. This was hatred. Someone wanted to ensure that Akhenaten would not exist in the afterlife, that his name would not be spoken, that his revolution would be forgotten. And for more than 3,000 years it worked. Amarna was buried in sand. Akhenaten became a ghost, a gap in the king lists that scholars noticed but could not explain. It was not until the 19th century CE, when archaeologists began excavating at Amarna, that Akhenaten's story was recovered. And even now, much of it remains mysterious. The royal tomb at Amarna was cut into the cliffs east of the city. Unlike the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which were relatively close to the workers' village and the administrative center, this tomb was remote. It required a long journey through the desert to reach it. The isolation was deliberate. Akhenaten wanted his burial place to be separate, pure, untouched by the corruption of the old religion. The tomb was never finished. The corridors were carved but not decorated. The burial chamber was prepared but never properly equipped. When archaeologists found it in the 1880s, it had been thoroughly vandalized. The sarcophagus was smashed. Fragments of burial equipment were scattered across the floor. The walls bore ancient graffiti, including one inscription that seemed to be a curse directed at Akhenaten himself. Was he ever actually buried there? We do not know. Some fragments found in the tomb suggest that Akhenaten's daughter Meketaten was buried there, possibly dying in childbirth. There are suggestions that Akhenaten's mother, Queen Tai, was also interred there temporarily. But Akhenaten himself? His body has never been conclusively identified. In 1907, a tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings, KV 55, containing a mummy that some scholars believe is Akhenaten. The burial was strange, clearly reinterred from elsewhere, with deliberate damage to the coffin and funerary equipment. DNA analysis of the KV-55 mummy shows he was related to Tutankhamun, probably his father. This would support the identification as Akhenaten, but other scholars dispute this. The mummy is too young, they argue. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years. This man died in his 20s or 30s. The debate continues, and so Akhenaten remains elusive even in death, his body as mysterious as his theology. If you visit Amarna today, you will find ruins in the desert, not impressive ruins like Karnak or Luxor. The stone structures were mostly dismantled in antiquity. What remains are the foundations of mud brick buildings, the outlines of streets, the depressions where gardens once grew, and tombs. The nobles who followed Akhenaten to his new city were buried in tombs cut into the cliffs surrounding Amarna. These tombs were decorated with scenes from the new religion, Akhenaten and Nefertiti worshipping the Aten, the sun's rays ending in hands that offer the hieroglyph for life. The tombs were never finished. When Amarna was abandoned, the nobles must have arranged to be reburied elsewhere, in tombs that would not mark them as followers of the heretic pharaoh. But the unfinished decorations remain, and they are beautiful. The art of the Amarna period has a grace and naturalism that is unique in Egyptian history. The rigid formality of traditional Egyptian art is loosened. The royal family is shown in intimate moments, Akhenaten kissing Nefertiti, their daughters playing, scenes of domestic life that would never appear in earlier royal iconography. It is as if, in abandoning the old gods, Akhenaten also abandoned the old restrictions on how pharaohs could be depicted. For a brief moment, Egyptian art became almost modern, and then the moment ended. When the old religion was restored, so was the old art style. The naturalism of Amarna was rejected. Later, pharaohs returned to the idealized, timeless portrayals that had prevailed for thousands of years. The Amarna experiment was erased not just theologically, but aesthetically. Only in the tombs and ruins did it survive, hidden in the desert, waiting for archaeologists to rediscover it 3,000 years later. Soft transition, the sound of wind across sand. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes remain closed. The sun is setting over Amarna now, painting the cliffs gold and red. The city is silent, as it has been for more than 3,000 years. Akhenaten's dream of one god and one truth has dissolved into sand. But the desert remembers, and we remember. And soon, we will descend deeper into the darkness, into the tombs themselves, where the secrets of death and resurrection wait in painted chambers. But for now, rest here in the ruins of the city of the horizon and let the last light fade into darkness. The ancient Egyptians did not fear death. They feared what came after. Death was a doorway, not an ending. Beyond that doorway was a journey through darkness, through dangers and challenges and tests that would determine whether the deceased would reach the field of reeds, the paradise where the blessed dead live forever, or be destroyed utterly, erased from existence. To survive this journey, you needed help. You needed spells, hundreds of them, instructions for navigating the underworld, for passing through gates guarded by demons, for answering the questions of hostile gods, for transforming yourself into different forms to escape danger. These spells were collected in what we call the Book of the Dead. Though book is misleading, there was no single authoritative text. Each copy was different, customized for the person who would use it. Some versions had a few dozen spells, some had over 200. The wealthy could afford elaborate versions on papyrus scrolls, beautifully illustrated with colored vignettes showing the deceased successfully completing each stage of the journey. the poor made do with cheaper versions, the spells written hastily on scraps of papyrus or even on the bandages wrapped around the mummy. But everyone needed something, because without the spells you were lost. Let us open one of these scrolls now, carefully, and read what the ancient Egyptians believed awaited them in death. When you die, your Ba, the part of you that is personality, consciousness, the essential self, separates from your body. This is frightening. The Ba is depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird hovering near the mummy. Without the body, the Ba is incomplete, vulnerable, lost in darkness. The first spell in many versions of the Book of the Dead is designed to give the Ba strength, to help it remember who it was, to prevent it from being scattered or confused in the chaos of death. I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the spell declares. I have the power to be born a second time. I am the divine hidden soul who creates the gods. This is not humble prayer. This is declaration of power. The deceased is asserting equality with the gods themselves, claiming the right to exist in the afterlife, not as a supplicant, but as a transformed being with divine authority. After speaking this spell, the Ba begins its journey. The first obstacle is a gate. All journeys through the Egyptian underworld involve gates. 7 gates, or 12, or 21, depending on which tradition is being followed. Each gate is guarded by demons with names like Blood Drinker and Bone Crusher and He Who Lives on Worms. To pass through, you must know the gate's secret name. You must address the gatekeeper correctly. You must prove that you have the right to pass. This is what the spells provide. The knowledge that transforms you from a helpless dead person into a powerful spirit who can command demons and compel gates to open. Open for me, the spell commands. I am equipped with your magic. I know your name and the name of the god who guards you, and the gate opens, not through violence or force, through knowledge. In the Egyptian conception of the afterlife, knowledge is the ultimate power. The person who knows the secret names, the correct formulas, the proper responses, can navigate any danger. The person who does not know is destroyed. The most famous scene from the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart. This is spell 125, and it appears in almost every version of the text. The deceased is led into the Hall of Two Truths, a vast chamber where 42 gods sit in judgment. At one end of the hall is a giant scale. The god Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of the dead, operates the scale. The god Thuth, ibis-headed god of wisdom, stands ready to record the result. The deceased's heart is removed and placed on one side of the scale. On the other side is a feather, the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and justice. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if it is free from sin, unburdened by evil deeds, the scale balances. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, it sinks. And if it sinks, a monster waits. She is called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a creature made from the 3 most dangerous animals in Egypt. She crouches beside the scale, jaws open, waiting. If the heart is heavy, Amit devours it, and the deceased is destroyed, not sent to hell or punished, simply erased, gone from existence as if they had never been born. This is the ultimate fear, not pain, not suffering, but complete annihilation. So spell 125 provides the deceased with a defense. It is called the negative confession. The deceased stands before the 42 gods and declares all the things they did not do. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. I have not made anyone suffer. I have not had sexual relations with a boy. I have not defiled myself. The list goes on. 42 declarations, one for each god. I have not polluted the water. I have not driven cattle from their pastures. I have not caught fish with bait made of fish. I have not held back water when it should flow. I have not built a dam against running water. Some of these are moral principles we would recognize. Do not steal. Do not murder. Do not cause suffering. Others are specifically Egyptian concerns. Do not pollute water. Critical in a desert civilization. Do not catch fish improperly. There were religious regulations about fishing. Do not dam water. Water rights were sacred. After the negative confession, the heart is weighed. But here is the secret that the Book of the Dead does not quite admit openly. The spell itself is magical protection. Speaking the negative confession correctly, knowing all 42 declarations, addressing each god by name. This knowledge itself makes the heart light. It does not matter what you actually did in life. What matters is that you know the spell. This is uncomfortable for us. We want the weighing of the heart to be about genuine moral judgment, about whether the person was actually good or evil. But for the Egyptians, it was about knowledge and preparation. If you could afford an elaborate Book of the Dead with all the correct spells, you would pass the test. If you were poor and died without proper burial and proper texts, you were vulnerable. The afterlife, like life itself, favored the wealthy. Many spells in the Book of the Dead deal with transformation. The deceased must be able to change form to navigate different parts of the underworld. Different dangers require different bodies. Spell 76, formula for assuming any shape one may wish to take. Spell 77, formula for assuming the form of a golden falcon. Spell 78, formula for assuming the form of a divine falcon. Spell 79, formula for being among the entourage of Re. Spell 80, formula for assuming the form of a god and giving light in the darkness. The list continues. Transform into a lotus flower, into a phoenix, into a heron, into a serpent, into a crocodile. Why these specific transformations? Each has symbolic significance. The falcon is associated with the sun god and with royal power. The lotus represents rebirth. It closes at night and opens at dawn. The phoenix is the mythical bird that dies in fire and is reborn from its own ashes. But there is also a practical element. To travel through the sky, you need wings. To travel through water, you need to become an aquatic creature. To pass through narrow spaces, you need to become a snake. The underworld is not a single landscape. It is many landscapes layered together, sky and water and earth and underground caverns. The deceased must be able to adapt, to take the form appropriate to each environment, and so the spells provide this power. I am the lotus pure which comes forth from the field of Ra. I am pure. Speak the spell and you become the lotus. Your body transforms. You are no longer limited by death or decay. You are fluid, changing, immortal. One of the strangest aspects of the Book of the Dead is the obsession with names. Secret names, true names, the hidden names of gods and demons and parts of the boat that carries the sun through the underworld. Spell 137b requires the deceased to name every part of the boat of Ra, not just the boat, but the specific names of the mast, the rudder, the steering oar, the tackle, the rowing benches, every single component. The name of the mast is She Who Brings Back the Great One After He Has Gone Away. The name of the steering oar is Finger of Horus. The name of the rope is Hair of Isis. Why does this matter? Because, in Egyptian magic, to know the true name of something is to have power over it. There is a myth in which the goddess Isis wants to gain power equal to the sun god Ra. She creates a serpent and makes it bite him. Ra falls ill, poisoned, in terrible pain. The other gods cannot help him. Isis comes forward. She says she can cure him, but only if he tells her his secret name, his true name. The name he has never spoken aloud, the name that contains his essential power. Ra resists. He tells her many of his names. He has hundreds of names, all the names by which he is worshipped and known, but not the true name. Finally, the pain becomes too great. He whispers the secret name to Isis, and in that moment she gains power equal to his. The Book of the Dead operates on the same principle. If you know the secret names, you have power. You can command the gods. You can command the gods. You can command the gods. You can navigate the underworld not as a fearful supplicant, but as a magical adept, speaking words of power that reshape reality itself. Not all spells in the Book of the Dead are protective. Some are aggressive. dangerous, the kind of magic that could be used to harm others. Spell 163 is a protection against having your head cut off in the underworld. This was apparently a real fear, that hostile beings would decapitate you, destroying your identity. Spell 164 prevents magical attacks. Spell 164 prevents magical attacks. Spell 165 protects against drowning. But there are also spells that reverse the usual order. Spells that allow the deceased to eat the gods, to consume their power, to become, through cannibalistic magic, more than human, more than divine. These spells are rare in the Book of the Dead. They appear more often in the earlier pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom, but their presence reveals something about Egyptian magic. It was not always nice. It was not always about protection and righteousness and passing moral tests. Sometimes it was about power, raw power, the power to destroy enemies, to consume the strong, to remake the universe according to your will. The priests who compiled the Book of the Dead tried to soften this. They emphasized the moral elements, the negative confession, the weighing of the heart, the importance of living a just life. But underneath, the older, darker magic remained. The knowledge that with the right spell, you could do anything, even things the gods feared. WHO. The spells, the Book of the Dead was not written by a single author. It accumulated over centuries, from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom and beyond. Different spells came from different sources. Some were very old, their language archaic even to ancient Egyptians. Others were relatively new. The priests of different temples had their own versions, their own preferred spells. When someone died and their family commissioned a Book of the Dead for them, the scribe would select from the available spells, creating a customized version based on what the family could afford and what they believed the deceased would need. The most expensive versions were works of art, written on high-quality papyrus in careful hieroglyphs, with elaborate vignettes painted in red and black and gold. The illustrations showed the deceased successfully completing each stage of the journey, meeting gods, passing through gates, being declared justified. These scrolls could be very long. The Papyrus of Ani, one of the most complete versions, is 78 feet long. Cheaper versions used cursive hieratic script instead of formal hieroglyphs. The illustrations were simpler or absent entirely. The papyrus was lower quality. The poorest people had just a few spells written on whatever material was available. But even the poor tried to get something, because dying without the spells was too terrible to contemplate. You would be lost in darkness, unable to speak the words that open gates or transform your body or protect you from demons. You would wander confused through the underworld until something destroyed you. The spells were hope, the promise that death was not the end, that with the right knowledge, you could navigate the darkness and reach the field of reeds, where the sun always shines and the grain grows high, and you live forever in peace. Your breathing is slow now, deep and even. The spells have done their work. You are protected. You know the secret names. The gates will open for you. Soon we will journey deeper into the places where the mummies lie waiting, wrapped in linen and silence. But for now, rest in the knowledge that the ancient Egyptians have given you. That death is a doorway. That beyond the darkness is light. That you are equipped for the journey. Sleep well. There is a valley in the desert west of ancient Thebes where no one was supposed to live. No houses were built there. No temples stood in the open. No crops grew. It was forbidden ground. Sacred ground. The mountain that rose above the valley was pyramid-shaped, a natural formation that the ancient Egyptians believed was sacred to the goddess Hathor and the god Amun. This was where the pharaohs chose to hide their tombs. Not invisible pyramids like their Old Kingdom predecessors, whose monuments announced their presence and inevitably attracted robbers. But underground, hidden, cut deep into the rock beneath the mountain. Over a period of 500 years, from approximately 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE, 63 tombs were carved into the Valley of the Kings. Most were for pharaohs, some were for pharaohs, some were for queens and nobles and royal children. All were attempts to cheat death and robbery and the erosion of time. Most failed. By the time archaeologists began systematic exploration in the 19th century, Almost every tomb had been robbed, some in antiquity, some in medieval times, some just decades before the archaeologists arrived. The mummies were stripped of gold, the burial goods were stolen, the coffins were smashed. But the tombs themselves remained, cut into the rock, their painted walls still brilliant with color, despite 3,000 years of darkness. Let us descend into one now. Let us walk the corridors that were meant for the dead alone. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings follow a pattern, not exactly the same in every case. Each pharaoh's tomb was customized and styles changed over the centuries, but the basic layout is consistent. A long corridor descends at an angle into the mountain. This is called the first corridor, or sometimes the corridor of the sun, because its walls are decorated with scenes from the solar texts showing the journey of the sun through the 12 hours of night. The corridor leads to a well shaft. This is a defensive feature. A deep pit, sometimes over 9 meters deep, designed to stop tomb robbers or at least slow them down. In some tombs, the bottom of the well shaft connects to false chambers meant to deceive robbers into thinking they found the burial, when in fact the real chambers lie beyond. Past the well shaft, the corridor continues, often turning at right angles to further confuse intruders. More rooms branch off the main corridor. Storage chambers for funerary equipment, annexes for specific ritual purposes, and finally, at the deepest point, the burial chamber. This is the heart of the tomb, the room where the sarcophagus rests, containing the nested coffins, containing the mummy of the pharaoh. The ceiling of the burial chamber is often painted with astronomical scenes, the goddess Nut swallowing the sun at sunset and giving birth to it at dawn, the constellations of the northern sky, the decans that marked the hours of the night. The walls are covered with texts, passages from the Book of the Dead, from the Amduat, from the Litany of Ra. All the spells and knowledge the deceased pharaoh needs to navigate the afterlife. The entire tomb is a three-dimensional magical text. Every image has meaning. Every hieroglyph is a spell. The architecture itself is part of the ritual. The descending corridors representing the sun's descent into the underworld. The burial chamber, the moment of deepest night before the resurrection at dawn. To enter the tomb is to enter a machine built for resurrection. The longest and most beautifully decorated tomb in the valley belongs to Seti I, who ruled around 1290 BCE. The tomb extends over 120 meters into the mountain, with multiple corridors and chambers, every surface covered in detailed painted reliefs. When the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni discovered the tomb in 1817, the colors were so fresh it seemed the painters had just left. The ceiling stars glittered gold against a deep blue background. The figures on the walls seemed to move in the flickering light of Belzoni's torch. Belzoni was stunned. He spent weeks exploring the tomb, making drawings, taking wax impressions of the reliefs to bring back to Europe. The burial chamber in Seti's tomb is especially spectacular. The vaulted ceiling shows the complete text of the Book of Gates, with the sun god's bark traveling through the 12 divisions of night, encountering demons and gods and the blessed dead. On the walls, Seti himself appears over and over, performing rituals, meeting gods, being embraced by Hathor and Osiris and Ra. In the center of the room, carved from a single massive piece of calcite alabaster, was Seti's sarcophagus. It is one of the most beautiful objects from ancient Egypt. Translucent stone carved inside and out with texts from the Book of Gates. When a light is placed inside, the hieroglyphs glow. The sarcophagus is now in the Sir John Soane Museum in London. Belzoni sold it to Soane after the British Museum declined to purchase it, considering the price too high. Seti's mummy was not in the tomb when Belzoni found it. It had been removed in antiquity during the 21st dynasty, when the priests realized that even the hidden valley tombs were not safe from robbers. They gathered the royal mummies and reburied them together in a secret cache. It was not rediscovered until 1881. In 1881, archaeologists noticed that extremely high-quality artifacts from royal burials were appearing on the antiquities market in Luxor. Someone had found a tomb. An investigation led to a family who had been secretly selling objects for years. Under pressure, they finally revealed the source, a hidden shaft in the cliffs near Deir el-Bahari, leading to a tomb that contained not one mummy, but more than 50. The royal mummies of the New Kingdom hidden together for safety more than 3,000 years ago. Seti I was there, Ramses II, Thutmose III, Amosa. Some of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history, their mummies still wrapped in linen, their faces preserved, lying in a jumbled heap in a tomb never designed to hold them all. The priests who hid them left labels, identifying each mummy and noting the regnal year when they were moved. Some mummies had been moved multiple times as earlier hiding places were compromised. It is both touching and tragic. Touching because the priests cared enough to try to protect the royal mummies even as their own civilization was collapsing. Tragic because the mummies ended up stacked like firewood, stripped of their gold and jewelry, their elaborate burial equipment scattered or stolen, reduced from god kings to anonymous bundles. When the archaeologists removed the mummies from the cache to transport them to Cairo, local people lined the banks of the Nile and wailed as the boat passed, mourning pharaohs who had been dead for 3 millennia. The old magic still worked. The dead kings were still kings. What the Arbibas left bead. Despite the robbery, despite 3,000 years of looting and decay, the tombs still contain wonders. The robbers took the gold and the jewelry and the valuable oils and perfumes, but they left the painted walls. They left the carved reliefs. They left the texts that were meant to guide the dead pharaoh through the underworld. And in some cases, they left smaller objects that seemed unimportant to them but are invaluable to archaeologists. Pottery shards with hieratic inscriptions recording deliveries to the tomb during construction. Fragments of burial equipment too damaged or too ordinary to be worth stealing. Broken shabtis, the small servant figurines that were supposed to work for the deceased in the afterlife. Scraps of linen from the mummy wrappings. From these fragments, archaeologists have reconstructed the funeral rituals, the construction process, the daily administration of the necropolis. We know the names of workers who built specific tombs. We know what food was provided during the funeral feast. We know how many days passed between the pharaoh's death and his burial. The tombs are not just monuments to the pharaohs, they are archives of the society that created them. We must talk about the curse. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he found it mostly intact, the only royal tomb in the valley to survive with its burial goods largely undisturbed. The discovery made headlines worldwide. The treasures were spectacular. The mummy was wrapped in gold. The burial mask has become one of the most recognizable objects from antiquity. And then Lord Carnarvon died. Carnarvon was Carter's patron, the wealthy Englishman who funded the excavation. In April 1923, just a few months after the tomb was opened, Carnarvon died in Cairo from an infected mosquito bite that developed into pneumonia. The newspapers immediately began to speculate, was it a curse? Had the pharaoh's tomb been protected by ancient magic that struck down those who disturbed it? More deaths followed, or seemed to. Over the next few years, several people connected to the excavation died, from illness, from accidents, from old age. The curse of the pharaohs became part of popular culture. Movies and novels featured mummies rising from their tombs to take revenge on archaeologists and tomb robbers. But here is the reality. There was no curse inscription in Tutankhamun's tomb, no warning to those who entered. No magical protection beyond the standard religious texts. Most of the people who entered the tomb lived long, normal lives. Carter himself lived until 1939, dying at age 64. Not young, but not suspiciously old either. The supposed curse victims were a mix of people who had direct involvement with the excavation and people who had only tangential connections. Some died years later from causes that had nothing to do with the tomb. Carnarvon's death, while tragic, was not mysterious. He was in poor health. Medical care in 1923 was primitive by modern standards. An infected mosquito bite was entirely capable of killing someone without any need for supernatural intervention. But the curse persists. Why? Because we want Egypt to have power. We want the ancient world to still be dangerous, still be mysterious, still be capable of reaching across 3,000 years to punish the living. The scientific truth is that the tombs pose no supernatural danger. But the psychological truth is that they do, because when you stand in the burial chamber of a pharaoh, surrounded by text designed to transform the dead into gods, you feel something: the weight of time, the presence of death, the knowledge that this place was built for purposes you cannot fully understand by people whose minds work differently from yours. That is the real curse, not magic, but the burden of confronting mortality and finding that the ancient Egyptians took it far more seriously than we do. The last pharaoh, the Valley of the Kings, was used for royal burials for about 500 years. The last confirmed pharaonic burial there was Ramses XI, around 1070 BCE. After that, the New Kingdom collapsed. Egypt fragmented into competing regional powers. The pharaohs of the Third Intermediate Period were buried elsewhere, often in the north, near the new political centers. The tombs remained, but no new ones were cut. The workers' village at Deir el-Medina was abandoned. The desert reclaimed the area. Medina was abandoned. For nearly 3,000 years, the Valley of the Kings was a place of ghosts. Treasure hunters came and went. Some tombs were robbed immediately. Some stayed hidden for centuries before being rediscovered and plundered. In the Greco-Roman period, tourists visited the valley. Graffiti in Greek and Latin appears on the walls of some tombs, showing that educated travelers came to see the ancient monuments even then. In medieval times, local guides knew the location of some tombs and took visitors to see them. But systematic archaeological exploration did not begin until the 19th century, and even then, with decades of excavation, new discoveries continued. Tutankhamun's tomb was found in 1922, after virtually everyone believed the valley had been exhausted. KV63, a storage tomb containing mummification materials, was found in 2006. KV64, containing a noblewoman's coffin, was found in 2011. The valley is not finished revealing its secrets. There are almost certainly more tombs waiting to be found, either intact or robbed, but still containing valuable archaeological information. The ground is honeycombed with shafts and chambers. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies that may be unexplored spaces. The mountain keeps its secrets still. You are deep underground now. The air is cool and still. The painted gods watch from the walls, their eyes following you in the lamplight. You are walking through eternity, through chambers built to last forever. And you are safe here. The dead pharaohs have no interest in you. They are on their own journey, through the 12 hours of night, toward rebirth at dawn. Let them go. Let yourself sink deeper into sleep. We will emerge from the tomb soon, into starlight and desert wind. But for now, rest here in the darkness that the pharaohs chose. The darkness that is not an ending, but a transformation. The ancient Egyptians did not worship animals. This is a common misconception. They worshipped gods who were sometimes depicted with animal heads or in animal forms. But the animal was a symbol, an aspect of the god's nature, not the god itself. Horus was not a falcon. Horus was a god whose power and nature were expressed through falcon imagery. Anubis was not a jackal. Anubis was a god whose role as guardian of the dead was symbolized by the jackal, a scavenger animal associated with cemeteries. This distinction was clear to the Egyptians. But over time, something changed. By the late period, around 700 BCE, Egypt had developed elaborate cults centered on sacred animals. Not symbolic representations, but actual living animals treated as incarnations of gods. Sacred bulls, sacred cats, sacred ibises, sacred crocodiles. Temples maintained these animals at enormous expense. They were fed special diets, housed in elaborate enclosures, mummified when they died, and buried with full ritual honors. And not just one sacred animal per temple. Thousands, tens of thousands. Catacombs filled with mummified animals, stacked from floor to ceiling, stretching for miles under the desert. This was one of ancient Egypt's strangest practices, and archaeologists are still trying to understand why. The most important sacred animal in ancient Egypt was the Apis bull. This was not just any bull. The Apis had specific physical characteristics that marked him as the living incarnation of the god Ptah, creator god of Memphis. The bull had to be black with a white diamond on his forehead. He had to have a white eagle shape on his back. He had to have double hairs on his tail. Other markings were prescribed in texts that have not survived in complete form. When an Apis bull died, priests searched all of Egypt for a new one. When they found a calf with the right markings, it was brought to Memphis with great ceremony and installed in a special temple complex. The bull lived in luxury, fed the finest food, attended by priests. Ordinary people could visit the bull and make offerings asking for the god's favor through his living representative. When the Apis bull died, the mourning was intense. Egypt went into official mourning as if a pharaoh had died. The bull's body was mummified using the same techniques applied to human royalty. The process took 70 days. The mummified bull was then transported to Saqqara and buried in a massive stone sarcophagus in the Serapeum, a vast underground gallery dedicated to the Apis burials. Each sarcophagus weighed dozens of tons, carved from single blocks of granite or limestone, moved into position in the underground chambers through engineering methods we still do not fully understand. The Serapeum was discovered in 1850 by Auguste Mariette. He found a complex of tunnels containing 24 massive sarcophagi, most still sealed. When the sarcophagi were opened, they contained the mummified remains of bulls, wrapped in linen, surrounded by amulets and ritual objects. These were not symbolic burials. These were full royal burials for bulls. The expense must have been staggering. Why? Because by the late period, the living Apis bull had become a focus of popular religion in a way that the distant, abstract gods were not. You could visit the Apis. You could see him. You could make an offering directly to a visible physical presence. In a world where the great temple rituals were performed behind closed doors by priests, where ordinary people had limited access to the official religion, the sacred animals provided something immediate and accessible, a connection to the divine that did not require intermediaries. Cats were sacred to the goddess Bastet. Bastet was originally a lioness goddess, fierce and warlike. Over time, her nature softened. By the late period, she was depicted as a cat, or a woman with a cat's head, a gentler goddess associated with home, fertility, and protection. Her main cult center was at Bubastis in the Nile Delta. The temple there was famous throughout Egypt. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described the annual festival of Bastet as the most popular in Egypt, attracting hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The temple maintained sacred cats, not just one or two, but hundreds, and pilgrims could purchase a mummified cat as a votive offering. This created an industry. Cats were bred specifically for mummification. When they reached a certain age, they were killed, usually by breaking the neck, and mummified. The mummies were sold to pilgrims, who then deposited them in the catacombs beneath the temple as offerings to Bastet. Archaeologists excavating the cat cemeteries at Bubastis and nearby Saqqara have found hundreds of thousands of cat mummies. Not thousands, hundreds of thousands. Stacked in chambers, piled in pits, sealed in parts. The scale is staggering and troubling. Because these were not beloved pets being carefully preserved by grieving owners. These were industrial products, mass-produced for a religious market. X-rays of cat mummies have revealed some disturbing facts. Many are kittens, very young, sometimes just weeks old. Some mummies contain incomplete remains, just a few bones wrapped in bandages shaped like a cat. Some contain no cat bones at all, just reeds or sticks wrapped in linen. This was fraud. Unscrupulous embalmers took advantage of pilgrims who wanted to make offerings but could not necessarily verify what was inside the wrapped bundle. You bought a cat mummy. You offered it to Bastet. You hoped the goddess would accept it and grant your petition. Whether there was actually a cat inside was apparently less important than the ritual itself. Ibises were sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and the moon. The white ibis with its distinctive curved beak was considered a manifestation of Thoth, the bird's association with the Nile. Ibises were common along the river, and its dignified, measured way of walking made it seem wise, contemplative, appropriate for a god of knowledge. At Saqqara and other sites, vast underground galleries were dedicated to ibis burials. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. One estimate suggests that over 4 million ibis mummies were buried in the catacombs at Saqqara. 4 million. The galleries stretch for hundreds of meters underground, chamber after chamber filled with pottery jars, each containing a mummified ibis. Some mummies are carefully prepared, wrapped in intricate patterns with painted cartonnage masks. Others are crude, hastily wrapped, clearly mass-produced. The same fraud seen with cat mummies appears here too. Some jars contain only partial birds or no bird at all. But the scale of the operation is what astonishes. To produce 4 million ibis mummies over several centuries requires industrialized bird raising and killing. This was not random collection of wild birds, this was farming. Ibis farms must have existed, though no clear archaeological evidence of them has been found. Perhaps they were outside the sacred precincts, in areas that have not been excavated or have been destroyed by later development. But somewhere, people were raising ibises by the thousands, killing them at the appropriate age, delivering them to embalmers who mummified them and sold them to pilgrims. And the pilgrims bought them and offered them to Thoth, hoping for wisdom or success in business or victory in a legal case or whatever petitions they brought to the god. This was religion as transaction. You give to the god gives to you. The mummified animal is the medium of exchange, the physical token that makes the transaction real. In the Fayoum region, southwest of Cairo, the crocodile was sacred. The city of Crocodilopolis, Shedit in Egyptian, had a temple dedicated to Sobek, the crocodile god. The temple maintained a sacred crocodile, kept in a pool, adorned with gold jewelry, fed choice cuts of meat by priests. Strabo, the Greek geographer, described visiting the temple in the 1st century BCE. The sacred crocodile was brought out for visitors. It was tame enough to allow priests to open its mouth and place offerings of food and wine inside. When a sacred crocodile died, it was mummified and buried in the extensive crocodile cemeteries near the temple. But as with cats and ibises, the practice expanded beyond just the one sacred animal. Pilgrims could purchase mummified crocodiles as offerings. This meant crocodiles had to be supplied in quantity. The cemeteries near Crocodilopolis contain thousands of crocodile mummies. Some are massive, adult Nile crocodiles, 3 or 4 meters long, carefully mummified. Others are babies, no longer than your hand. Some are eggs. The variety suggests that different price points were available. A wealthy pilgrim could afford a large, well-mummified crocodile. A poorer person could buy an egg or a hatchling. But all were acceptable offerings to Sobek. The god apparently was not particular. Why? Why did ancient Egypt develop these elaborate animal cults? The question has puzzled scholars for decades. Some theories, the animal cults generated enormous revenue. Pilgrims had to pay for the mummified animals. They paid for other offerings. They stayed in towns near the temples, stimulating local economies. The priests who managed the cults controlled this wealth. In a period when Egypt was no longer a great imperial power, when the wealth that had flowed from conquest was gone, the animal cults may have been a way for temples to maintain their economic position. Religious, the late period was a time of anxiety in Egypt. Foreign powers ruled or threatened. Traditional certainties were eroding. The old gods seemed distant, ineffective. The animal cults offered something more immediate. A god you could see, touch, make offerings to directly. A transaction that felt concrete and reliable. If you offered a mummified cat to Bastet, you had done something real. You had participated in the divine economy. You could hope for results. Psychological. Animals mediate between human and divine. They are alive like us, but other. They do not speak. They live according to their natures in ways that seem both familiar and mysterious. A cat is simultaneously domestic and wild, affectionate and aloof. It seemed appropriate as a symbol of a goddess who was both protective and dangerous. An ibis moves with deliberation, stands motionless in thought. It seemed wise. A crocodile is powerful, ancient, deadly, but controllable if you know how. It seemed like a god. By mummifying these animals and offering them to the gods they represented, worshippers were participating in a symbolic system that made sense emotionally, even if it seems strange to us now. The animal cults declined in the Roman period and ended entirely with the spread of Christianity. Christian authorities viewed the animal cults as paganism at its most absurd. The idea of worshipping animals, of mummifying them by the thousands, seemed both ridiculous and offensive. The temples were closed, the sacred animals were killed or released, the catacombs were sealed or forgotten. For centuries, the existence of the vast animal cemeteries was unknown to Europeans. Occasional discoveries were made, but the scale was not understood. Then, in the 19th century, excavations began to reveal the truth. Chamber after chamber of mummified animals. Millions of them. Some excavators treated them as curiosities. Some treated them as trash. In the 1880s, a shipment of cat mummies from Egypt was sold in England as fertilizer. Tons of mummified cats were ground up and spread on fields. This seems horrifying now. But at the time, the Victorian excavators did not see the cat mummies as sacred objects or even as particularly valuable archaeological specimens. They were just organic matter. Ancient organic matter, but organic nonetheless. Today, we understand that even the mass-produced animal mummies contain valuable information. DNA analysis can tell us about ancient animal populations. Isotope analysis can reveal what the animals were fed. Study of mummification techniques shows how the practices changed over time. The animal cults that seemed like Egypt's strangest excess are now recognized as a window into the religious and economic life of the late period, a time when gods needed to be made concrete and accessible, when religion became transaction, when the sacred and the commercial merged in ways that made perfect sense to the Egyptians but seem utterly alien to us. The catacombs are quiet now. The millions of mummified animals rest in darkness, stacked and forgotten. The gods they were offered to have faded into history, but the mystery remains. Why did a civilization as sophisticated as ancient Egypt mummify millions of cats and ibises and crocodiles? The answer is there, in the dark galleries, waiting for us to understand what sacredness meant to people who lived 3,000 years ago. Let that mystery settle into your mind gently as you drift towards sleep. You do not need to solve it tonight. The darkness will keep the secret safe until morning. Rest now. There was a building in ancient Egypt that was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. Not the pyramids, though they were already ancient when this building was constructed. Not the temples of Karnak or Abu Simbel, though they are vast and impressive. This building was called the Labyrinth. Herodotus saw it and described it as surpassing even the pyramids in wonder. Strabo saw it and marveled at its complexity. Pliny the Elder wrote about it, copying from earlier sources. It contained, according to these ancient historians, 3,000 rooms, chambers above ground and chambers below, corridors that twisted and turned in patterns so complex that a visitor without a guide would be hopelessly lost. It was, they said, the most magnificent building ever constructed by human hands, and we cannot find it. We know approximately where it was. We have descriptions from multiple ancient sources. We have some archaeological remains that might be parts of it. But the labyrinth itself, the vast complex with 3,000 rooms, has vanished. This is the final dark secret of ancient Egypt, that even the things that were famous, that were described in detail, that thousands of people visited and marveled at, can disappear so completely that we are not certain they ever existed. Let us search for the labyrinth now, in the darkness before dawn, and see what traces remain of wonder. Herodotus at the Labyrinth Herodis visited Egypt around 400 BCE. He was a Greek historian, one of the first to systematically investigate and record the world beyond Greece. His histories contain extensive descriptions of Egypt, some accurate, some garbled, all filtered through Greek cultural assumptions. But when Herodotus describes the labyrinth, his awe seems genuine. He says it was located near Lake Moeris in the Fayum region southwest of Cairo. It was built by multiple pharaohs. though he credits much of it to the rulers of the 12th dynasty around 1900 BCE. The building had 2 levels, one above ground, one below. The upper level contained 1,500 rooms arranged in a complex pattern. Herodotus was allowed to walk through these rooms, and he describes them in detail. Wide corridors opening into chambers, chambers connecting to other chambers, courtyards surrounded by columns, halls decorated with reliefs showing pharaohs and gods. The lower level, he says, was even larger, 1,500 rooms beneath the ground, carved into the bedrock. But Herodotus was not allowed to see the lower level. The Egyptian priest told him it contained the tombs of the pharaohs who built the labyrinth and the tombs of sacred crocodiles. It was forbidden for foreigners to enter. Herodotus accepted this. He describes what he was told, but makes clear he did not witness it himself. What he did see, he says, surpassed the pyramids. Not in scale, the pyramids are larger single structures, but in complexity, in artistry, in the sheer ambition of creating something so intricate and vast. I found it greater than words could tell, he writes. This is high praise from a man who had seen many of the wonders of the ancient world. Strabo's disfigurement. Strabo visited Egypt about 400 years after Herodotus in the 1st century BCE. By this time, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. The Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Greek culture had merged with Egyptian traditions to create a hybrid civilization. Strabo describes the labyrinth in terms similar to Herodotus, but with more architectural detail. He says the building had as many rooms as there were nomes, administrative districts, in Egypt. Each nome had its own section of the labyrinth, where officials conducted business and rituals. The structure was designed, he says, so that you could walk through the entire complex and eventually return to your starting point without retracing your steps. The corridors turned and twisted, creating a path that seemed endless but was actually a closed loop. This would require extraordinary planning and geometric sophistication. Strabo also mentions that by his time, the labyrinth was already falling into ruin. Some sections had collapsed. Some were being quarried for stone to use in other construction. The wonder of the ancient world was being dismantled, piece by piece, for raw materials. This is a pattern seen throughout Egypt. Ancient buildings were treated as quarries by later generations. The facing stones of the pyramids were removed to build Cairo. Temples were dismantled for their granite and limestone. The labyrinth suffered the same fate. And because it was not a massive solid structure like a pyramid, but an intricate complex of walls and rooms, once the quarrying began, the entire building could disappear relatively quickly. The search begins. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists began systematic exploration of Egypt, finding the labyrinth became a goal. The ancient sources all agreed on its approximate location, near the entrance to the Fayum, near the pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara. Flinders Petrie, one of the most important early Egyptologists, excavated at Hawara in the 1880s and 1890s. He found the pyramid of Amenemhat III and the ruins of a large building south of the pyramid. This, he believed, was the labyrinth, or what remained of it. The ruins were extensive but confusing, walls that seemed to go nowhere, fragmentary foundations, vast amounts of smashed limestone and granite. It was clear that something very large had stood here. But the 3,000 rooms Herodotus described, the complex corridors Strabo marveled at, if they had ever existed, they were gone. Petrie found evidence that the site had been used as a stone quarry for centuries, perhaps more than a millennium. Everything above ground had been systematically removed. Even many of the foundation stones had been taken. What remained was a debris field, a footprint, an absence where something magnificent had once stood. Petrie did his best to reconstruct the plan from what little remained. He believed the labyrinth had been a mortuary temple for Amenemhat III's pyramid, but built on an unprecedented scale. Most mortuary temples are single buildings, relatively compact. The labyrinth, if Petrie's reconstruction was correct, covered an area of over 70,000 square meters. It would have been the largest roofed building in ancient Egypt. But was it actually the labyrinth the ancient historians described? Petrie believed so, but the evidence was fragmentary, and other archaeologists were skeptical. The underground chambers. Remember that Herodotus was not allowed to see the lower level of the labyrinth. The priests told him it contained tombs and was forbidden. If this level existed, it might still be intact underground, while the upper level was quarried away. This has been the hope of archaeologists for more than a century, that somewhere beneath the ruins at Hawara or nearby, there is a vast complex of chambers waiting to be discovered. Various attempts have been made to find it. Ground-penetrating radar has been used. The results have been tantalizing but inconclusive. There are certainly cavities beneath the surface. But cavities could be natural limestone caves, or they could be ancient chambers. Without excavation, it is impossible to say. And excavation is difficult. The site is in a low-lying area. The water table is high. Any underground chamber would likely be flooded. Pumping out water and excavating in saturated conditions is expensive and technically challenging. Several teams have announced plans to conduct such excavation. So far, none have succeeded in revealing the underground labyrinth. It may not exist. The chambers Herodotus described may have been a smaller structure that the priests exaggerated to impress their foreign visitor, or they may be there, waiting in the dark water beneath the desert, sealed for more than 2,000 years. What was the labyrinth for? If we accept that something like the labyrinth existed, a massive complex with hundreds or thousands of rooms, why was it built? The ancient sources suggest administrative functions. Straber's description of sections for each nome implies the building was used for bureaucratic purposes, perhaps as a central meeting place for regional governors. It may also have had religious functions. Mortuary temples were not just tombs, they were places where rituals were performed to maintain the deceased pharaoh's K, his spiritual essence. A pharaoh as important as Amenemhat III might have required a mortuary temple of unusual size and complexity. Some scholars have suggested the labyrinth was a literal labyrinth in the Greek sense, a structure designed to be confusing, to disorient visitors perhaps as part of mystery initiations or religious rituals. The twisted corridors, the 3,000 rooms, the inability to find your way out without a guide, all of this could have been deliberate, creating a physical experience of being lost that mirrored spiritual journeys through death and rebirth. Or it might simply have been the ancient world's largest filing cabinet, a place to store the documents and records of Egypt's administration, with different sections for different types of records, organized in a way that made sense to the bureaucrats who used it, but seemed impossibly complex to outsiders. We do not know. Without the building, we are left with speculation. The labyrinth has become a labyrinth of interpretation, each scholar wandering through the fragmentary evidence trying to find a path to understanding. Other labyrinths, its Egypt was not the only ancient culture to build labyrinths. The most famous is the Cretan labyrinth, supposedly built by the inventor Daedalus to house the Minotaur. Greek myth says Theseus navigated this labyrinth using a ball of thread given to him by Ariadne, killed the Minotaur, and escaped. This story has been interpreted in many ways. Some believe it reflects memories of the complex palace at Knossos, with its hundreds of rooms and confusing layout. Others see it as purely symbolic, a metaphor for the difficulty of escaping fate or the complexity of the human mind. But there may be a connection to Egypt. The Greek word labyrinth may derive from labyrinthos, which some scholars link to the Egyptian word lapi ro hunt, meaning temple at the mouth of the canal, a possible reference to the location of the Egyptian labyrinth near the canal connecting Lake Moeris to the Nile. If this etymology is correct, then the Greek concept of the labyrinth originated in Egypt. The Egyptian labyrinth was the original, the template that inspired the myths and the later European labyrinths built in medieval cathedrals and gardens. All of them echoes of a building that no longer exists. A building that may have been the greatest architectural achievement of ancient Egypt, now reduced to rubble and speculation. The labyrinth metaphor. Perhaps the disappearance of the labyrinth is appropriate. Perhaps it was always meant to be elusive. The ancient Egyptians believed that sacred knowledge should be hidden, protected, revealed only to those who were properly initiated. Their temples had public courts where anyone could enter, but the innermost sanctuaries were reserved for priests. The rituals performed there were secret. The Book of the Dead was a collection of spells that allowed the deceased to navigate the afterlife, itself a labyrinth of gates and challenges and transformations. The underworld was described in texts like the Ambient and the Book of Gates as a series of chambers through which the sun god traveled during the night, encountering dangers, battling enemies, emerging transformed at dawn. The entire Egyptian cosmos was labyrinthine, complex, layered, requiring knowledge to navigate safely. So a physical labyrinth, a building that embodied this complexity, makes perfect symbolic sense. And the fact that we cannot find it, that might be the final lesson, that some knowledge is lost, that even the greatest works of civilization can vanish, that the past is not a book we can simply open and read, but a mystery we reconstruct imperfectly from fragments. The labyrinth is gone, but the idea of the labyrinth remains. And perhaps the idea is more important than the building ever was. What remains? At Hawara, in the ruins south of Amenemhat III's pyramid, there are scattered stones, fragments of columns, pieces of walls, limestone blocks carved with hieroglyphs, most too damaged to read. If you visit the site, and few tourists do, it is remote and there is little to see. You can walk across the debris field and try to imagine what once stood here. A building larger than any temple. A complex so intricate that ancient historians compared it to the pyramids and found the pyramids lacking. A wonder of the ancient world, lost not to time alone, but to the deliberate dismantling by people who needed building stone more than they needed wonders. This is the reality of archaeology. Most of the past is gone. What survives is accidental, the things that were buried, the things that were remote enough to escape quarrying, the things that were made of materials too worthless to steal. The labyrinth was none of these things. It was accessible, built of valuable stone, located near population centers that needed construction materials, so it was taken apart, stone by stone, room by room, until nothing remained but confused foundations and the descriptions of ancient historians who saw it when it still stood. We will probably never find the labyrinth. Not in the way that Tutankhamun's tomb was found intact and full of treasures. The labyrinth is gone. But the absence itself tells us something. It tells us that even the greatest works are temporary. That stone and labor and architectural genius cannot guarantee immortality. That the past is always slipping away from us, even as we try to hold it. The pharaohs built tombs to last forever, and most were robbed within decades. The priests wrote spells to guide the dead through eternity, and we read them now as curiosities. Someone built a labyrinth with 3,000 rooms, and we cannot find it. This is the darkest secret of ancient Egypt. Not the curses or the mummies or the hidden chambers, but the simple fact that everything ends. Everything is forgotten. Everything returns to dust and fragments and silence. Even wonders. Even Egypt itself. The night is deep now. You have walked through 3,000 years of darkness with me, through workers' villages and forbidden cities, through tombs and temples and underground galleries, through the places where ancient Egyptians hid their secrets. Some of those secrets have been revealed. Some remain hidden. Some are lost forever. And that is as it should be. Because mystery is necessary. Wonder requires not knowing. If we understood everything, if every tomb had been found, and every text translated, and every building reconstructed, ancient Egypt would lose its power over us. It would become merely history. But because gaps remain, because questions persist, because buildings like the labyrinth have vanished into legend, ancient Egypt stays alive in our imagination. It is not a dead civilization. It is a sleeping one, waiting in the darkness for us to rediscover it, piece by piece, chamber by chamber, spell by spell. And you are part of that rediscovery. By listening to these stories, by learning these secrets, you are carrying ancient Egypt forward into the future. The pharaohs wanted to live forever, and in a sense they do. Not in their mummies, dried and damaged in museum cases, but in stories like this one. In the knowledge that passes from generation to generation. in the fascination that draws people to Egypt's mysteries even 3,000 years after the last pyramid was built. They live in you, in your dreams tonight, in the images that will drift through your sleeping mind, painted tombs and golden masks and endless sand. Sleep now. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of eternity. Let your thoughts dissolve into the darkness that surrounded the mummified kings. You are safe in this darkness. It is not an ending. It is a transformation, like the spells in the Book of the Dead promised, like the journey through the 12 hours of night, like the sun that sets in the west and rises again in the east. Reborn, you will sleep, you will dream, you will wake. And when you wake, ancient Egypt will still be there, waiting in the desert, keeping its secrets, holding its mysteries close. But you will know a little more than you did before. You will have walked through the darkness and emerged transformed. Sleep well. The gods are watching, not to judge you, but to guide you safely through the night. In ancient Egypt, there was no clear distinction between medicine and magic. The same priests who performed temple rituals also treated the sick. The same spells that protected the dead in the afterlife were recited over the living to drive out disease. The boundary between physical and spiritual healing did not exist in the way we understand it today. But the ancient Egyptians were not primitive in their medical knowledge. They performed surgery. They set broken bones. They understood anatomy better than any other ancient civilization because they spent thousands of years opening bodies to prepare them for mummification. They knew that the heart pumped blood, though they misunderstood how. They knew that the brain was important, though they thought consciousness resided in the heart, and discarded the brain during mummification. They had pharmaceutical knowledge that modern science is only beginning to validate. Honey as an antibiotic, willow bark for pain relief, moldy bread as a source of penicillin-like compounds. They wrote medical texts on papyrus, cataloging diseases and injuries and treatments with systematic precision. And they kept secrets. Knowledge of the human body was power. The ability to heal was sacred. The techniques of embalming were closely guarded. Not everyone was allowed to know how death was defeated or how the body was preserved for eternity. Let us enter the house of life now, the temple complex where priest-physicians trained and learn what they knew about the mysteries of flesh and spirit. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the oldest surgical text in human history, is Egyptian. It is called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, named after the American antiquities dealer who purchased it in 1862. But the text itself dates to approximately 1600 BCE, and it may be a copy of a much older document, possibly from as early as 3000 BCE. This is not a magical text. This is systematic observational medicine. The papyrus contains 48 case studies of injuries, primarily to the head and upper body. Each case follows the same structure: the title of the injury, the examination procedure, what the physician should look for, feel for, measure, the diagnosis, a clear statement of what is wrong, the prognosis, whether the condition is treatable or not. The text uses three categories: an ailment which I will treat, an ailment which I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. And if treatable, the treatment, specific instructions for surgery, bandaging, medication, follow-up care. The precision is remarkable. Case 5 describes a skull fracture with a depression in the bone. The physician is instructed to palpate the fracture carefully, feeling for bone fragments. If fragments are loose, the case is an ailment not to be treated. The patient will die. Case 6 describes a facial wound with a broken cheekbone. The physician should examine the fracture from inside the mouth, pressing on the bone to determine if it is displaced. Treatment involves packing the wound with linen soaked in grease, then monitoring for fever. Case 8 describes a compound fracture of the skull with exposed brain tissue. This case includes the oldest known description of the brain's physical appearance. The text compares the brain's surface to corrugated slag from copper smelting, an accurate observation of the brain's convoluted surface. The prognosis for this case: an ailment not to be treated. There is no false hope in this text. The physician-priest knows the limits of his knowledge. Some injuries cannot be survived. Some patients will die regardless of treatment. This honesty is unusual in ancient medical texts, which often promise cures for everything. But the Egyptian physician understood something important: that acknowledging what you cannot do is as important as knowing what you can. The Kehun gynecological papyrus medicine in ancient Egypt was sometimes specialized. The Kahun papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, deals exclusively with women's health, pregnancy, fertility, gynecological diseases. It is the oldest known medical text devoted specifically to women's medicine. Some of its contents are recognizable as reasonable medical observation. Descriptions of prolapsed uterus, vaginal infections, complications of pregnancy. The symptoms are described accurately even if the treatments are sometimes ineffective. Other sections are more mysterious. The papyrus includes several pregnancy tests. One instructs the woman to urinate on wheat and barley seeds planted in separate bags of cloth. If the barley grows first, the child will be male. If the wheat grows first, the child will be female. If neither grows, she is not pregnant. Modern researchers have tested this method. Surprisingly, urine from pregnant women does cause grain to germinate faster than urine from non-pregnant women, probably due to elevated estrogen levels. The method does not predict the baby's sex, but as a pregnancy test, it has some validity. This is typical of Egyptian medicine, a mixture of observation-based knowledge and symbolic thinking that sometimes accidentally produces results. Another section of the papyrus deals with contraception and fertility control. The methods described include vaginal pessaries made from crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, or acacia leaves ground with honey and dates. The crocodile dung is probably useless, possibly harmful. But the acacia is interesting. Acacia contains lactic acid, which modern research has shown has spermicidal properties. The ancient Egyptians may have discovered, through trial and error, a plant-based contraceptive that actually worked. They did not understand why it worked. The concept of sperm and eggs and fertilization was unknown to them. But they observed that women who used acacia pessaries were less likely to become pregnant, and they recorded this knowledge for other physicians to use. The embalmers' knowledge. The embalmers knew the human body better than anyone else in ancient Egypt. They spent their careers cutting open corpses, removing organs, preserving flesh, understanding through direct observation what was inside the human form, but they were not physicians. This is important. In ancient Egypt, there was a sharp division between those who healed the living and those who prepared the dead. The embalmers worked in the Per-Nefer-Rapha, the house of embalming, which was separate from the temples where physicians trained. The embalmers were often viewed with a mixture of respect and revulsion. They performed necessary sacred work, but they worked with death, with decay, with the pollution of the corpse. After working on a body, an embalmer had to undergo purification rituals before he could enter a temple or interact normally with the living. The knowledge embalmers possessed was considerable. They knew exactly where to make incisions to remove organs without excessive damage to the body cavity. They knew which organs could be removed through the small abdominal incision and which required other access points. They knew that the brain could be extracted through the nose by breaking the ethmoid bone and using a long hooked instrument to pull out brain tissue in pieces. They knew preservation techniques, which substances prevented decay, which combinations of natron and resins produced the best results, how long each stage of the process should take. And this knowledge was secret. Deliberately secret. Greek historians who visited Egypt and wrote about mummification got many details wrong because the embalmers would not fully explain their methods to outsiders. Herodotus describes 3 levels of embalming, corresponding to 3 price points. His description of the most expensive method is reasonably accurate, but his description of the cheapest method includes details that make no anatomical sense, suggesting that either he misunderstood what he was told or the embalmers deliberately misled him. Why keep the knowledge secret? Partly economic. If everyone knew how to embalm, the professional embalmers would lose their livelihood. Partly religious. The transformation of the corpse into a mummy was a sacred process, a magical working that required proper training and ritual purity. Sharing the knowledge with the uninitiated would profane it. and partly cultural. Egyptian society was stratified, with knowledge distributed according to social position. Priests knew things that nobles did not. Nobles knew things that farmers did not. Embalmers knew the secrets of the dead, and that knowledge stayed with them. The treatments that worked some ancient Egyptian medical treatments were effective by modern standards. Honey for wound care. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture out of bacterial cells, killing them. It also has anti-inflammatory properties. Egyptian physicians used honey extensively for treating wounds, burns, and ulcers. Modern medicine has rediscovered honey's antibiotic properties and now uses medical-grade honey for wound care in cases where antibiotic-resistant infections are a concern. Willow bark for pain. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Egyptian physicians prescribed willow bark tea for headaches, fever, and general pain. They did not understand the chemical mechanism, but they observed that it worked. Moldy bread on wounds. Bread that has gone moldy may contain penicillium fungi, which produce penicillin. Egyptian medical texts sometimes recommend applying moldy bread to infected wounds. Whether this actually delivered therapeutic doses of penicillin is debatable, but the concept is sound. Copper compounds for eye infections. The Evers Papyrus recommends copper salts for treating eye infections. Copper has antimicrobial properties. This treatment probably helped with bacterial infections of the eye, which were common in Egypt due to dust, flies, and the practice of using coal eye makeup that could introduce bacteria. Surgery for cataracts. There is evidence that Egyptian physicians performed cataract surgery, couching the lens, pushing the clouded lens to the side of the eye with a sharp instrument so light could reach the retina. This is a crude procedure by modern standards, but it could restore some vision to people who were otherwise blind, setting fractures and using splints. Egyptian physicians were skilled at setting broken bones. Mummies have been found with fractures that healed in good alignment, indicating proper medical care. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes splinting techniques that are reasonable by modern standards. All of this demonstrates that Egyptian medicine was not simply superstition. It was based on observation, trial and error, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. But it was always mixed with magic, because the Egyptians did not separate physical and spiritual causes of disease. The treatments that didn't work. Egyptian medicine also included treatments that were useless or actively harmful. Many prescriptions in the medical papyri involve ingredients that have no therapeutic value and are included for symbolic or magical reasons. Lizard blood, mouse tails, pig teeth, fly excrement. These appear in various remedies, not because they work, but because of their associations in Egyptian magical thinking. A remedy might include mouse tails because mice are associated with a particular god, or fly excrement because flies are associated with decay and disease, and like cures this is sympathetic magic, not medicine. One prescription for baldness involves a mixture of burned hedgehog spines, oil, honey, alabaster, and red ochre applied to the scalp. The hedgehog spines are included because hedgehogs have prominent spines. The sympathetic connection is obvious. This will not cure baldness. Another remedy for eye disease involves a mixture of bat blood, lizard eyes, and pig's earwax. This will not cure eye disease. It might make it worse by introducing infection. The medical papyri contain hundreds of such prescriptions, mixing effective treatments with useless or harmful ones, making it difficult to determine whether Egyptian physicians actually understood which treatments worked or simply preserved everything that tradition recommended. Probably both. They observed that some treatments helped. They also believed that magical ingredients and spells were necessary components of healing. And in some cases, the belief itself may have helped. The placebo effect is real, and a patient who believes they are receiving powerful magical healing may experience genuine improvement. The House of Life, the Per Ankh. The House of Life was where medical knowledge was taught and preserved. These were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were temple libraries and scribal schools attached to major temple complexes. The most famous House of Life was at Heliopolis, the center of solar worship near modern Cairo. Others existed at Thebes, Memphis, Abydos, and other important cities. In the House of Life, young priests were trained in reading and writing, religious texts, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The medical training was extensive. Students copied the classical medical texts, learning the cases and treatments by heart. They studied anatomy, not through dissection of human bodies, that was forbidden to physicians, reserved only for embalmers, but through animal dissection and analogy. They learned materia, medica, the hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products used in Egyptian medicine, how to identify them, prepare them, combine them. They learned diagnostic techniques, how to examine a patient, what questions to ask, what signs to look for, and they learned the spells, because healing required both physical treatment and magical protection. A physician treating a scorpion sting would both apply a poultice of herbs and recite the spell for repelling the poison of Serket, the scorpion goddess. A physician treating a woman in difficult labor would both perform manual manipulations and recite spells invoking Hathor and Taure, goddesses of childbirth. The spell was not separate from the treatment. The spell was part of the treatment, necessary for it to work. This makes sense within Egyptian cosmology. Disease was caused by hostile forces, demons, the malice of the dead, the anger of gods. Physical symptoms were manifestations of spiritual attack. Treating only the physical symptoms without addressing the spiritual cause would be like treating symptoms of infection without killing the bacteria. The infection would return, so the spell was necessary. It protected the patient from further spiritual attack, while the medicine healed the physical body. What killed them despite their medical knowledge? Ancient Egyptians died young by modern standards. Average life expectancy was probably around 30 to 35 years, though this figure is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live to 50 or even 60. What killed them? Infectious diseases were the primary cause. Tuberculosis, malaria, schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease from contaminated water. All were endemic in ancient Egypt. The Nile River, which gave life to Egypt, also harbored parasites. Schistosomiasis, caused by tiny worms that penetrate the skin of people wading in the river, was so common that bloody urine was considered normal in boys reaching puberty. They thought it was a male equivalent to menstruation. Dental disease was severe. The Egyptian diet included bread made from grain that was ground on stone mills, which left tiny particles of grit in the flour. This wore down teeth severely. Even young adults often had teeth worn to the gum line. Abscesses were common and could lead to fatal infections. Infectious diseases that we now prevent with vaccines or treat with antibiotics were often fatal. A simple wound that became infected could kill. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child. The wealthy had access to physicians and could afford elaborate medical treatment. But even with treatment, many conditions were beyond the ability of ancient medicine to cure. Cancer, heart disease, stroke, kidney failure, these killed ancient Egyptians just as they kill modern people, but without any possibility of effective treatment. Mummies show evidence of all these conditions. We can see atherosclerosis in the blood vessels of Egyptian mummies, hardening of the arteries from diet and genetics. We can see evidence of cancer in bone lesions. We can see the results of stroke in asymmetrical muscle development suggesting paralysis. The ancient Egyptians suffered the same degenerative diseases we do. They just had no way to treat them. The physician-magician, Medicicans, the most powerful medical practitioners in ancient Egypt, were those who combined physician training with magical expertise. These were the physician-magicians, men who held titles indicating they were both sonwi, physician, and hika, magician. They were rare and highly valued. A physician-magician could treat illness on all levels: physical, spiritual, magical. He could perform surgery and recite spells. He could prepare medicines and create amulets. He could diagnose whether a disease was caused by natural factors or by curse and treat accordingly. Some physician-magicians were attached to the royal court. The pharaoh had his personal physicians, men whose responsibility was maintaining the health of the god-king. This was an enormous responsibility. If the pharaoh became sick or died, it reflected badly on the physician. In some cases, physicians who failed to save royal patients were themselves punished or killed, but successful royal physicians were rewarded generously. They received estates, gold, positions of authority. Some became famous beyond Egypt. Egyptian physicians were requested by foreign rulers who had heard of their skill. The Hittite king Hattusili III wrote to Ramses II requesting an Egyptian physician to help his sister, who was having difficulty conceiving a child. Ramses sent a physician-magician along with a statue of a fertility goddess to strengthen the magical component of the treatment. Whether the treatment worked, we do not know. But the request itself shows the reputation Egyptian medicine had in the ancient world. The certs that died with them, much of Egyptian medical knowledge was lost when the civilization ended. The Arab conquest in the 7th century CE brought new medical traditions that replaced the old Egyptian practices. The temples where the houses of life had operated were closed or converted to other purposes. The medical papyri were buried, scattered, destroyed. Some survived by accident, preserved in the dry climate, hidden in jars, eventually rediscovered by archaeologists. But most are gone. We have fragments of perhaps a dozen major medical texts: the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Kohun Papyrus, the Berlin Papyrus, a few others, but these represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. There were probably hundreds of medical texts in the various houses of life, containing knowledge accumulated over 3,000 years. Most of that knowledge is lost. We will never know all the treatments Egyptian physicians used, all the herbs and compounds they prepared, all the surgical techniques they developed. Some of that lost knowledge might be valuable even today. Pharmaceutical companies have begun researching traditional medicines from various cultures, finding that some folk remedies contain genuinely effective compounds. The same may be true of Egyptian medicine. Some of the lost remedies in those vanished papyri might have contained valuable medical knowledge, but we will never know. The secrets died with the last of the physician priests, sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. And all that remains are the fragments we have found and the mummies themselves. Silent patients whose bodies still bear evidence of the diseases they suffered and the treatments they received 3,000 years ago. Soft transition. The sound of papyrus pages turning. Very quiet. Breathe slowly. Let your body relax. The physician priests of ancient Egypt worked with both flesh and spirit, understanding that healing required addressing the whole person. You are whole tonight. Your body is resting. Your spirit is quiet. Let the ancient knowledge settle into your mind like sediment sinking through water. Soon we will explore one more mystery. But for now, rest here in the House of Life, surrounded by the whispered wisdom of healers who lived 3,000 years ago. They cannot heal you now, but their knowledge remains, preserved in fragments, waiting to be rediscovered. Sleep gently. In the darkness of an ancient tomb, someone is chiseling. Carefully, methodically, they work their way across the wall, removing hieroglyphs, not random vandalism. Specific hieroglyphs, specific names. They are erasing a pharaoh from history. This happened multiple times in ancient Egypt. Rulers who were deemed unworthy, heretical, or inconvenient were systematically removed from the record. Their names were chiseled out of inscriptions. Their statues were smashed or defaced. Their monuments were dismantled or usurped by later rulers. The goal was not just political, to remove a rival's memory. The goal was theological, to erase their existence so completely that they would not survive in the afterlife. In Egyptian belief, your name was your identity. To destroy the name was to destroy the person, not just in life, but in eternity. This was the ultimate punishment, worse than execution, which merely ended your physical life. This was damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. So thorough that you would cease to exist on every level. Let us search now for the pharaohs who were erased, who disappeared from history so completely that for thousands of years we did not know they had ever existed. And let us ask why Egypt wanted them forgotten. Hatshepsut was one of the most successful pharaohs of the New Kingdom. She ruled for approximately 22 years, from around 1479 to 1458 BCE. During her reign, Egypt prospered. She launched successful trading expeditions to the land of Punt, bringing back valuable goods. She commissioned magnificent building projects, including her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, one of the most beautiful structures in ancient Egypt. She was also a woman. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Egypt had female rulers before. Sobeknefru in the 12th dynasty, Nitocris possibly in the 6th dynasty, but Hatshepsut did something different. She did not rule as a queen regent, governing on behalf of a male heir. She declared herself pharaoh, full pharaoh with all the titles and regalia. She was depicted in official art wearing the false beard of kingship, the Nemes crown, the royal kilt. She was portrayed with a male body in many statues, though inscriptions sometimes used feminine grammatical forms. This was ideologically complicated for Egypt. The pharaoh was not just a political leader, but a religious figure, the living Horus, the intermediary between gods and humans. The role was conceptually male. Hatshepsut managed this tension by emphasizing her divine birth. She commissioned reliefs showing that she was the daughter of the god Amun-Ra himself, who had impregnated her mother in divine form. If she was the daughter of the chief god, her right to rule was unquestionable, and for 22 years it worked. Then she died, and the erasure began. Not immediately. For perhaps 20 years after her death, Hatshepsut's monuments remained intact, her name undisturbed. Then, systematically, her images were defaced. Her name was chiseled out of inscriptions and replaced with the names of her male predecessors or her successor, Thutmose III. Her statues were torn down, smashed, buried in pits. Her obelisks were walled up so they could not be seen. The goal was to remove her from the king lists, to pretend she had never ruled. Why? For many years, scholars assumed Thutmose III was responsible, destroying his stepmother's memory out of resentment that she had usurped power that should have been his. But the evidence does not support this. The erasure began long after Hatshepsut died, when Thutmose III was an old man and had reigned successfully for decades. He had no reason to fear her memory. More likely, the erasure was ideological. Later pharaohs wanted to restore the proper order, male succession, with no interruption by a female ruler. Hatshepsut's reign was an anomaly that had to be corrected in the historical record. So she was removed, and for more than 3,000 years it worked. When scholars in the 19th century compiled lists of Egyptian pharaohs based on ancient sources, Hatshepsut was missing. The reign passed directly from Thutmose II to Thutmose III, with no mention of the woman who ruled between them. Only through archaeology, through the monuments that survived despite attempts to destroy them, through inscriptions that were damaged but still partially legible, was Hatshepsut rediscovered. Her mummy may have been identified in 2007, found in a simple tomb in the Valley of the Kings, far from the magnificent mortuary temple she had built for herself. Even in death, she was displaced, but her memory survived. Despite everything, despite 3,000 years of erasure, we know her name, Hatshepsut, and we know that she was pharaoh. A.K. Hanyatan, the Hebritic king. We have discussed Akhenaten already, but his erasure deserves deeper examination. Because the attempt to remove Akhenaten from history was more thorough than what happened to Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was erased because she was female. Akhenaten was erased because he was heretical. After his death, the restoration of traditional religion came with a program of deliberate destruction. Every mention of the Aten was chiseled out. Every image of Akhenaten was defaced. The city he built, Akhetitan, was abandoned and never resettled. His name was removed from king lists. His reign was assigned to other rulers. The official chronology skipped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, eliminating Akhenaten and all his immediate successors. The stones from his buildings were buried inside other structures, hidden away so they could not be seen. This was not just political revision, this was theological necessity. Akhenaten had attempted to destroy the traditional gods. In response, the traditional religion destroyed him as completely as possible. The erasure was so successful that for more than 3,000 years, Akhenaten was forgotten. The pharaoh who had built a new capital, who had revolutionized Egyptian art, who had attempted the most radical religious transformation in ancient history, he was gone from the record. Only in the 19th century, when archaeologists began excavating at Amarna, was he rediscovered. And even now, much about him remains mysterious. We do not know for certain how he died. We are not sure we have identified his mummy. We do not fully understand his motivations. Akhenaten remains even after rediscovery, partially erased. The damage done 3,000 years ago cannot be entirely undone. Between Akhenaten's death and Tutankhamun's accession, someone ruled Egypt. For a brief period, perhaps 2 or 3 years, the throne was occupied by a mysterious figure named Nefertiti. We know this from a few inscriptions, a few seals, fragmentary evidence that someone with this name held pharaonic titles. But we do not know who they were. Some scholars believe Nefertiti was Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife, ruling in her own right after his death. Others believe it was Smenkhare, a mysterious male figure who appears briefly in the records, possibly Akhenaten's co-regent or successor. Others believe Nefertiti and Smenkhare were the same person or 2 different people who ruled sequentially, or 2 names for the same complicated situation. We do not know. The evidence is too fragmentary. And it is fragmentary because whoever Nefertiti was, they were erased as thoroughly as Akhenaten himself. Their monuments were destroyed. Their name was removed from inscriptions. Their burial was never found, or was found and robbed and left unidentifiable. This is the most complete erasure in Egyptian history. Not just removed from king lists, but removed so thoroughly that we are not even sure if they were male or female, how long they ruled, or what happened to them. Nefertiti is a phantom, a name without a face, a ruler without a story, an erasure so complete that even archaeologists with all our modern tools cannot fully reconstruct who they were. They ruled Egypt, and then they vanished into the darkness from which we are still trying to retrieve them.